Josh Dawson, and he's gonna talk about the Indian residential schools and the contested history of the IRS. His presentation is called "A Fractured Door: The Contested History of the IRS." Josh, the floor is yours.
I wanted to begin firstly just by thanking the organizers as well as the other panelists for a really great day of excellent presentations and papers. So thank you all for that. But I also did want to acknowledge the land from which I'm able to speak today. So I'm reading from what is today known as St. Catharines in Ontario. So I'm across the ocean from a lot of you, still in Canada myself. So it's a city that's located on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe peoples. This land was covered by the 1792 Treaty Between the Lakes, or Treaty 3, and I'm grateful for the opportunity today to live in that area, to work in that area, and to share ideas with you today. And I should also maybe extend those thanks specifically to Christina for the paper that she just gave. In my paper, I didn't get a chance to really delve into the history of the residential schools or the discourse around reconciliation, but I think you did a really nice job of sort of preempting that. So thank you, Christina. So to begin, on the left-hand side there, the image that I have is of the Joussard School, or what is formerly the Joussard School in Alberta, and that's an image taken from Cree poet Billy Ray Belcourt's collection, Indian Coping Mechanisms. So the idea of the fractured door refers to that image. And that image really corresponds to the state of many of the residential schools today. Some of them have been preserved, so I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just wanted to sort of give you an image to pair with this history as I went through it. So the Canadian Indian Residential School, which I'm going to refer to as the IRS the rest of my presentation, was from the beginning an institution founded upon and surrounded by ambivalence and ambiguity. And independently, both of the quotes that I provided here that serve as epigraphs for my paper meaningfully respond to that history and some of the complexities. But I think that it is combining them or putting them together that they more powerfully speak to the complex negotiation of memory and memorialization that's going on today. So the current situation of the 160 officially recognized schools, and just a brief note, that number is taken both from the TRC as well as changes that have come about in understanding the schools after the TRC. So it's still sort of a contentious number itself. So the status of those schools differs quite drastically today. Some have already been completely destroyed. Some have come to take on different roles, such as Indigenous-run schools, museums, cultural centers, and one has even come to be a ski resort. And more recently, in September of 2020, two of them had been named as National Historical Sites. And it was the transformation of these last two schools from ruins testifying to Canada's failed genocide of its Indigenous populations into sites of national history that first sparked my interest in the memorialization around the IRS, which then leads me to the question, so if, as Cree poet Billy Ray Belcourt suggests, Canada is an asylum constructed with the sooty bones of Indigenous peoples, how might stone monuments, which insist upon their indigeneity as they themselves fade into the landscape, help to express and memorialize this reality? So basically here, this is a timeline of important events that I'm going to be covering. So I just wanted you guys to have that to refer to as I speak. In order to understand the centrality of the IRS in the consciousness of Indigenous peoples and settler Canadians today, I'll begin with the history of how the discourse around the IRS and the government's responsibility for the schools has shaped the public's understanding of it. The federal government of Canada has offered three official responses to the IRS, beginning with then Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, Jane Stewart's address speaking to the findings of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, or RCAP. Stewart's address was delivered in January of 1998, and because of its conciliatory language, it has been read by scholars such as Kibi Martin as the first of three apologies offered by the federal government. So even though there's only two official apologies, that first statement is still roughly understood as the first sort of apology. However, Stewart's language is carefully crafted and is instructive of the socio-cultural context surrounding the IRS discourse in the early 1990s. The RCAP itself was founded was formed in response to the events in Oka, Quebec in the summer of 1990, whereby the inequity between Indigenous and settler Canadians was brought into sharp relief when the Canadian military was deployed to end what has since come to be known as the Oka Crisis or the Siege at Oka. While the eyes of Indigenous and settler peoples alike were drawn to Oka that summer, almost exactly 1 month after the siege ended, Ojibwe politician Phil Fontaine added further material to the debate through his nationally televised disclosure of widespread sexual abuse in the IRS. Fontaine's testimony that he, along with each of the 20 other boys in his grade 3 class, had suffered some form of sexual abuse drastically changed settler Canadian public perception of the IRS. Sociologists Ronald Neisen and Eric Taylor Woods have similarly argued that the revelation of sexual abuse is responsible for the return of the IRS to public consciousness in the early 1990s, and indeed it is such abuse that forms what Stewart refers to as the, quote, tragedy of the IRS in her address. Stewart's apology for the tragedy of abuse, however, is not an admission of government responsibility. Instead, her remarks carefully separate the government's development of the schools from the tragedy that occurred within them, though she does apologize for the fact that the tragedy occurred. The vague and evasive language of Stewart's address set the stage for the government's later, more formal apologies, including then Prime Minister Stephen Harper's 2008 apology that he delivered to the Canadian Parliament. Harper's apology borrows much of its language from Stewart's address, so much so, in fact, that Kiwi Martin describes its delivery as a case of, quote, therapeutic amnesia. However, an important point of distinction between Stewart's address and Harper's apology appears in the form of a qualifying remark that was published on the Government of Canada website, but that Harper omitted during his parliamentary delivery. The line, and this is what I have here on the slide for you to see, 132 federally supported schools were located in every province and territory except Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, is not only factually inaccurate, which prompted Justin Trudeau's apology 9 years later, but shows that even in such a public gesture, the federal government continues to speak guardedly about the IRS and to evade its responsibilities. As a result, Harper's apology appears, to borrow from Matthew Dorrell, more focused on closure rather than disclosure. Indeed, Harper's desire to prematurely close discussion of the IRS, as well as his intentional exclusion of Newfoundland and New Brunswick, which did in fact have schools that today are considered part of the IRS, show the consistent contestation present in the discourse around the IRS and efforts to reduce it to part of the landscape, even prior to the formation of any sort of monument. Justin Trudeau's 2017 apology, which was delivered in Goose Bay, Newfoundland, sought to correct Harper's statement about residential schools that were in operation in the province, and like the two previous government responses, he too spoke of the hope of building a new future. Trudeau offered context for his words, explaining that as Canada reflected on 150 years of Confederation, now was the opportunity to pause, to think about the future we want to create, that we must create, and that we will create. And the we that he's referring to there, I won't comment on that, but you can imagine for yourselves who he's thinking about is actually doing this work. While he offers scant details as to the process of building this future, Trudeau does point to, quote, telling the story of the schools so that history will never be forgotten as one key. This story, Trudeau goes on to say, must come from Indigenous peoples in their own way and in their own words so that settler Canadians might learn it. While it is clearly important that Indigenous voices have a place to speak, Trudeau's apology removes any obligation from settler Canadians, including himself, to change or to act. This point is especially important in that Trudeau's apology came not only after the publication of the final report of the RCAP, which included 440 recommendations to improve the relationship between Indigenous peoples and settler Canadians, but also 2 years after the publication of the findings of the TRC, which added an additional 94 calls to action. The lack of a concrete plan of action is unfortunately unsurprising, given that most of the calls to action of both the RCAP and TRC remain unrealized even today. However, some progress has been made towards realizing Action 81, which calls upon the federal government, in collaboration with the survivors, to commission and install a publicly accessible, highly visible residential school national monument in the city of Ottawa. Trina Cooper-Bolam analyzes the complexity of establishing such a monument and emphasizes how there could not be a greater disparity between Canada's National Program of Historical Commemoration and the subject and form of the proposed National IRS monument. More precisely, where traditional monuments endorse positive heritage values, the IRS monument speaks to Canada's situation in a period of societal and national redefinition in the wake of the TRC. A national monument is certainly a valuable symbol that speaks to the reality of the IRS as a project of genocide constructed in the interests of nation building, but the TRC commissioners also recognize the need for more localized markers of the history of the IRS, and in Action 82, they also call for the construction of monuments in the capital cities of each province and territory. As symbolically valuable as such monuments might be, like the rhetoric of the three government apologies, they obscure deeper complexities in the process of national narrative and memorialization. In uprooting the history of the IRS from its empirical locations to national and provincial capitals, the past and settler Canada's implication in it is enclosed rather than disclosed. More precisely, because these geographical locations are only meaningful in the context of the national narrative of Canada, rather than opening a space for survivors and Indigenous peoples to tell their stories, memorializing the IRS through these monuments subsumes Indigenous suffering into Canada's settler narrative. Jason Chalmers traces a similar dynamic at work in an essay on Canadianizing the Holocaust. He explains that there is no single historical narrative used to engage Canada in Holocaust memory, but rather a set of several, both positive and negative, overlapping narratives. Primary amongst the negative narratives is the story of Canada's pre- and wartime anti-Semitism, best expressed by the none is too many policy towards Jewish immigrants and galvanized by Canada's turning away of the MS St. Louis in 1939. This negative narrative is embraced, Chalmers explains, and incorporated into a longer positive national narrative that emphasizes the, quote, national myth of progress and demonstrates that Canadian society has since overcome its troubling past. Moreover, the Canadian national narrative's capacity to contain several conflicting narratives has significant implications for the memorialization of the IRS as well. For example, it is not difficult to imagine the negative narrative that is the lived experience of the IRS becoming sublimated into the very same positive national myth, whereby the Canadian state can celebrate how much it has learned from the RCAP and TRC and point towards the national and provincial monuments as tangible evidence of this new knowledge. As an alternative to memorialization centered on the Canadian nation, former IRS sites in situ might themselves be used. Such an approach would retain some of the benefits of a national monument in terms of speaking to the far-reaching nature of the IRS, but would also loosen the connection between the competing narratives of survivors of the IRS and that of the Canadian state. More precisely, the approach I'm proposing would not simply establish more IRS sites as national historical sites, like those that I mentioned at the outset, but rather would allow them to function as anti-monuments, as described by Quinton Stevens. Anti-monuments come in many different forms, as Stephen points out, including those that are dialogic and which critique the purpose and design of specific existing monuments. Monuments situated at the locations of former IRS schools could form such a dialogic relationship with the proposed national and provincial monuments, and thus speak to the differing relationships that Indigenous peoples and settler Canadians have to the IRS. More traditional monuments would remain in locations that are key to the Canadian state to serve as reminders to settler Canadians that such locations are founded upon the dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples. At the same time, localized monuments could provide a parallel mechanism whereby Indigenous peoples' voices are heard and spaces are respected without them also being held accountable for settlers. Moreover, the anti-monumentality of such a framework for memorialization could be extended beyond this dialogic relationship and into the form of localized IRS monuments as well. And that's why I started with that image of the sort of the ruin at Joussard. So bearing in mind that the structures that composed the IRS were, even while they were in operation, known for being poorly constructed, the memorialization of the IRS could follow the precedent set by memorials such as Jochen Goertz and Esther Scheves-Goertz's 1986 Monument Against Fascism. To be more precise, the localized memorials could, like the Monument Against Fascism, emphasize the ephemeral over the concrete, activity over observation, and destruction over preservation. In the case of the Monument Against Fascism, the public was invited to write or draw upon it, and you can see that on the left-hand image that I have there. The monument is exposed and you have people drawing upon it. So the public was invited to write or draw upon it as it was gradually lowered into the ground. And as Stephen points out, the unexpected ways that the public responded to these tasks serve as a social mirror that reflects the public's differing sentiments towards the past and attempts to commemorate it. Moreover, when the monument was lowered out of view in 1993, the image that you can see on the right, the ethical burden of remembering the past was thereby returned to the public itself. A similar engagement with the IRS has already taken place between Indigenous peoples and 5 specific residential school sites, wherein survivors, their families, and members of the community return to the site of their trauma and exercise agency over the past by physically destroying and then burning the former school. Not only is this a powerful and cathartic exercise, but it is in keeping with the grieving protocols practiced by many Indigenous communities that maintain that it is better to let go of the past rather than to continue to confront it. However, these events were led by specific communities and did not occur in tandem with other memorialization practices. As a result, they do not form a dialogic relationship with the national monuments and do not function as anti-monuments. To reiterate, it is not enough to establish a system of national monuments to the IRS because of the threat of the monuments narrative becoming part of the national myth of Canadian progress. At the same time, the possible danger of memorializing the IRS using national monuments in dialogue with localized anti-monuments is that in time, as the local anti-monuments are destroyed and or naturally eroded, that their memory work will again become a burden for Indigenous peoples to bear. This is the challenge to be faced by the other calls to action in the TRC, including specifically the calls to action, and as Christina pointed out, the need for further education reform. The hope being that in time, settler Canadian society will be attentive to both the meaning of the national monuments as well as the profound absence of localized monuments, and that the narratives of both sets do not, as James Young describes, simply fade into the Canadian national landscape. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Josh. I actually have 2 questions myself. First of all, and that was actually related to Christina's presentation as well. To what degree actually is the Canadian educational system, which is highly provincialized, of course, to what degree is that actually an impediment to changing that national narrative? I always remember Granatstein's book, Who Killed Canadian History, as some sort of commentary that Canadian history or Canadian national history doesn't exist anymore, but you two clearly showed that Canadian national history, even though in a provincialized educational system, still exists. So I'm just wondering, how much of an impediment is that provincialized educational system to changing the truth about the Indian residential school system?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'm by no means an expert on all of the nuances of the provincial education and the differences among the different provinces and territories. So I make no claim to have that knowledge, but I do think it's sort of a double-edged sword. So it sort of embraces that ambiguity that I alluded to in the opening statements, in the sense that all of the IRS institutions across the various provinces and territories also operated quite differently from one another. So even though we think about the IRS as the sort of national project that was highly controlled and that sort of thing, there was very little sort of national oversight. And in fact, many people had no idea what other people were doing in the IRS at the same time. I found a letter, I believe it's published as part of the TRC, but there's a letter where this person was appointed to be the principal of a school, and he had actually written to Ottawa to ask, what are the limits of my power? What are sort of the expectations of this position that I've fallen into? And it was written back that there was no such protocol. So sort of just do what you feel like you can do, and manage reasonably. So having said that, I guess the problem you're pointing to, the impediment to the provincial curriculums, is that there's not a single solution that will address everything. So of course that's the problem. But I think the benefit there is that each of those provincial curriculums can also address the unique situations in each province. So where colonization was a lot more, or occurred a lot earlier in, for example, on the eastern coast, the curriculum can be crafted to reflect that reality, whereas there's a differing reality in the prairies versus the west coast. So I think that malleability could also be used very productively as well. The problem, of course, is it actually needs to happen, which, as Christina pointed out, there seems to be very little progress in that regard. And just anecdotally, I think I'm a little bit older than Christina. I think, I'm not certain, but I am venturing to guess. But I do remember the residential schools being mentioned when I was in high school. But the way that they were presented, they were sort of shown as something that far in Canada's past, and they were resolved and it was done with. And certainly not the reality. There was sort of no talk of genocide or anything of that nature. And it was sort of a one-day thing, sort of an offhand comment. This happened, but it's done, and it was a long time ago. And then we'll move on to celebrating John A. Macdonald and everyone else.
Thanks for that, Josh. Is there anyone else with a question? Let's see. I think there is. I actually have one more. So what always struck me when I was reading testimonies by Indigenous people that went to the IRS was always the idea of our oral traditions and our roots are being cut off. So I'm actually wondering, to what degree could the reconstruction of the oral traditions in Indigenous cultures actually form as a monument itself? Could there be a certain monumentalization of the oral traditions as a sort of counter proposal against the Canadian government? Because of course they're well known of incorporating Indigenous monuments, as the 2010 Olympics showed as well.
Right.
completely misusing the local Indigenous symbols. But I'm just wondering, to what degree could actually, as a sort of counter proposal from Indigenous communities and cultures themselves, to what degree could oral traditions form as a monument, but then an oral monument against the Canadian national narrative?
Yeah. Unfortunately, again, you sort of you preempted my response a little bit, because the first thing that immediately came to mind was the National Archive to the TRC, which is in Winnipeg, which currently houses, they're not oral exactly, they're digital testimonies that have been recorded. So that was the immediate sort of response that I had to that. So to a certain extent, that has sort of also been co-opted as part of this national narrative because it's a national, center. But it is a location that is run by Indigenous peoples, and I know that they make a consistent effort to really prioritize Indigenous hires and that sort of thing as part of it. So I do think that it is a little bit of a space of resistance as well. And maybe I shouldn't be so cynical in terms of my presentation of what's going on in Canada. I'm sure that there are still a lot of good initiatives taking place. But just, you don't see as much momentum as you would like to. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on really briefly is the importance of language revitalization. A lot of testimonies are being published, at least in part, in Indigenous languages, and they're sort of refusing to translate them into English. So this is another space where people are consciously resisting those sort of national narratives and really emphasizing the importance of, we could say the oral tradition, even though a lot of them are being written.
All right, thanks for that. Christina, you have not a lot of time, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be a quick question, so go ahead.
I actually was going to touch on what Josh just mentioned, that in the West Coast, there's a huge language revitalization thing going on. And actually at that museum that I spoke about, they had a massive exhibit that you can go in and actually hear all the different dialects, and they've built this really interactive online map where you actually can see anyways, so there is a bunch of stuff is being done on that. The other quick thing about oral stuff as well, from my own personal experience, because I worked for the provincial government on the West Coast, it's a mandatory training if you're going to do any type of policy engagement stuff to take a couple mandatory I guess courses on basically how Indigenous nations want to communicate with government. And then when I would go and engage with different nations, we never brought PowerPoint slides and handouts and stuff. We did it the way that they wanted to engage with us. And we generally sat in a circle and we actually followed their language and oral way for them to communicate. So I think that obviously isn't being done as much as it should in all areas, but there is some positive stuff that's trying to be done. I know I can speak for the provincial government on the West Coast from what that was it.
Okay, thanks for that. There's 3 more minutes left till 4 o'clock, so I'll end the session here. Thank you once more for all speakers. Thank you all for joining this session, and we'll see each other again in the main room.
Thank you.